Let us now turn to the other group of interpretations in Chapter 2, the ones called internal. The theory here with internal methodologies is that now the person who tells a myth, celebrates a myth, observes a myth, is responding to something in his mind. There are ways that we have particular emotions, fears, conceptions, images, things we see, things we think about, things we feel, things we imagine. And all of these come together in order to form mythological stories in our mind. Please pay very close attention to Ken Dowden, Chapter 2, in this regard. He talks about this in very close detail, and you should make sure that you understand what he's referring to. For instance, he talks quite a bit about the use of the snake as a female element in many mythologies. The fact that the snake might represent a male fear of female influence and such. So you should take a look at that so that you understand some more about the way that our internal mental structure might make us come up with myths in the way that we do. There is an ancient poet, Lucretius, from the 1st century BC. He imagined, when he was talking about the senses, that we in fact see senses exactly as things are around us. So we see things accurately, we hear things accurately. Obviously, we would take issue with that today with modern science. But one of his ideas was that if we had particular images of things that we're afraid of, we might combine them into monsters. So if we're really afraid of lions, we're really afraid of snakes, and of course we're positively terrified of goats, because we know how horrific goats are, we combine them and we make a chimera. That's an example. Okay, and yes, goats are frightening. No, just kidding. Okay, now, let's talk about the methodologies listed in Chapter 2 of Harris and Plätzner. First one, Freud. You probably have heard of him, Sigmund Freud. As you probably do know, he had a whole theory regarding the psychology of the mind based on dreams. That much of what we feel, and especially much of what we suppress because of our fears, has to do with dreams. From Freudian belief, the thought is that when we dream things at night, what we dream is likely to inspire the mythological stories that are then created. It's a little bit similar to what Lucretius talked about with sensation, that when we see things, and especially if we're afraid of them, then we're going to end up creating myths in association with what we fear. Freud is commonly associated with Oedipus, the king of Thebes who killed his father and married his mother, because of the so-called Oedipus complex. I should just let you know as a caution that although there are references in Freud to the so-called Oedipus concept, that the actual Oedipus complex as a theory really isn't associated with Freud. It's only indirectly so because of his casual reference. In reality, that was something that was developed later in response to Freud's writing. Next, we have Freud's student Jung. Jung came up with the concept that patterns in mythic stories are predictable and can be tied back to archetypes. Archetype is a Greek word meaning something that is created at the beginning before other things are modeled after it. So the archetypal type of mythology means that no matter what kind of story is being told, and especially whatever pattern of character is created, any part of the world, you'll often find that certain types of things happen repeatedly. For instance, you probably know Cinderella, that she was tormented by her evil stepmother before she eventually went on to marry the handsome prince. Well, an evil stepmother often shows up in many different mythologies. So that's an example of the archetype, as well as, of course, the beautiful damsel in distress, the very handsome prince, and so on. And of course, married happily ever after at the end. So those are what archetypes are. Narratology has a somewhat similar concept. Narratology means that in general, stories, especially stories of heroes, tend to follow a very specific track. You'll often find, whether it's Luke Skywalker, whether it's Harry Potter, whether it's Percy Jackson, you'll often find that the hero starts off separated from his parents in some way. Frequently his parents are killed, or he may be an orphan, of course, or maybe he grows up in in an orphanage, or he grows up because he was taken away from his parents when he was a very young baby. Often he gets raised by other relatives, usually an uncle or an aunt. That should sound familiar. Sometimes they're benevolent, sometimes not so much. That should be familiar too. Frequently the hero, as he grows up, begins to realize that he's somehow different from others. He may be of partly divine birth, or he may have something else unusual about his background that distinguishes him from people around him. Often because of that, he's often pariahed. He's often treated as somebody unusual, different. He might be mocked or in some way set aside. If you think of the ugly duckling in a way, as not accepted by other ducks in Hans Christian Andersen, that is an example too. So then the hero often has to go on a journey. He has to complete some kind of a quest. Often along the way he'll encounter some damsel in distress who's been kidnapped by an evil lord, general, king, whoever, has to get her out. Maybe there's a dragon to slay. Then they sail home, but of course when they sail home, of course there's a shipwreck, or there's a chase scene and they get thrown overboard, whatever it might be. And eventually, though of course the hero does get his woman home and is able finally to become a successful king. Although sometimes, even when he becomes king, problems come up later. If you think of King Arthur, there's an example. So these patterns are very predictable, and narratology is a way of identifying those patterns in order to say that myths are told in those patterns because they're easy. We can identify them with them. We've read other stories like them. We get to say, yep, we know who the bad guy is. We know who the lady in distress is. If sometimes the lady in distress is a little bit more, let's say, macho than we might expect, that might be nice to enhance the story a little bit, make it more interesting. Again, that should sound familiar. And so on. Narratology. Structuralism is bipolar opposites. Day, night. White, black. Man, woman. Good, evil, and so forth. Structuralism says that myths were created in order to explain the relationship between these opposites, and especially, we're going to see this later when we talk about the two gods, Apollo and Dionysus, especially to consider splits in our own personality. We might be very rational, like Apollo, and then we may be crazy, out of control, like Dionysus. We have both parts of our personality, and structuralism is an effort to not really end the tension, but at least to explain it and help us to cope with it and maybe even benefit from it in some way. And feminism, finally, is an explanation that says that myths are often created as a way of incorporating women into male society in some respect. Women, of course, in the ancient Greek and Roman worlds were quite severely disadvantaged in many ways. The Roman women probably less so than the Greek women, but the Greeks were keenly aware that women had an appropriate place in society, but nonetheless were not in any way equal to men. And feminism was a movement in Greek scholarship showing that many types of writings and also artwork in the ancient Greek and Roman worlds are often motivated by trying to show where women fit properly in society. The fact that it is understood that the women are disadvantaged, and the Greeks really are not entirely comfortable with that, even though they may not necessarily be prepared to make any major changes about it. We're going to see quite a few examples of that. One caution I do want to say, though, is that as I understand feminism, we have to be careful not to think of the ancient male authors themselves as definitively feminist, because although there will be times you can see women given, let's say, perhaps a privileged status or being given a voice as to how they are disadvantaged and the consequences of that and how they feel about it and the way the men treat them, which is often not good. Although that's often true, it should be nonetheless understood that neither Greeks nor Romans necessarily were trying to give women equal status with men, or even necessarily to improve their status. It was more like, this is the way it is about women versus men. It's probably not good. It probably shouldn't happen this way, but it seems to be necessary. We don't believe that there's any way to change that without very severe consequences somewhere else. So there are your methodologies. Once again, Freud, Jung, narratology, structuralism, feminism, the one based on dreams, the one based on specific particular patterns like a stepmother, the ones based on the whole narration of a story like a hero's tale, the one based on opposites, directly opposed 180 degrees, and finally the one based on sensitivity to the women's role in society, and possibly the recognition that women are more disadvantaged than is either fair for them or appropriate for the society as a whole. There you go, chapter 2, and that completes the video series for June 28th. I'll see you here back again tomorrow with a single video on our first major author for the course, Hesiod, his two works, Theogony and Works and Days. Again, make sure that you complete the single discussion question for both chapters 1 and chapter 2. Make sure to submit them in your Dropbox or on the forum. And again, please make sure that you have already marked your attendance in the attendance forum on Sakai. We'll see you here tomorrow, and once again, thank you for taking this journey with us. See you.